We all want to know where we come from. It's a deep human question, our origin story. For a long time, we relied on myths, on religious texts. They gave us comfort. They gave us meaning. But as science grew, as we learned more about the natural world, another kind of story started to take shape. This is the story of evolution. It's a story told through rocks, through bones, through the very building blocks of life itself. And lately, it feels like we're making huge leaps forward. People are wondering, are we close to really solving it? Are we about to understand the whole thing? From the very first spark of life to us, right now. It's a big question, and it's not just one thing. When we talk about our origin story, we're talking about a few big chapters. There's the start of life itself. How did non-living chemicals turn into something alive? That's called abiogenesis, and it's a tricky one. Then there's evolution, the story of how that first simple life changed, adapted, and branched out into all the amazing diversity we see around us today, including us. Most of the time, when people talk about solving the origin story in a scientific context, they mean getting a much clearer picture of that evolutionary journey. And we have made incredible progress there. Think about where we started. For centuries, people mostly believed that species were fixed, that they had always been the way they were. Then, a couple of hundred years ago, people like Charles Darwin came along. He observed, he traveled, he saw things like the finches on the Galapagos Islands, birds that were very similar but had different beaks, perfectly suited to different foods on different islands. There, he started to put the pieces together. He proposed a radical idea, natural selection. He said that individuals with traits that help them survive and reproduce in their environment are more likely to pass those traits on. Over long periods, this slow, steady process changes species. It sounded simple, but it explained so much. It explained adaptation. It explained why life was so diverse. Darwin published his big book on the origin of species in 1859. It was a bombshell. It changed how people thought about life, about themselves. But Darwin didn't know everything. He didn't know how traits were passed on. He saw the pattern, but not the mechanism. That missing piece came a little later from a monk named Gregor Mendel, who was experimenting with pea plants. He figured out the traits are passed down in discrete units, which we now call genes. His work, though revolutionary, was largely ignored for decades. It wasn't until the early 20th century that scientists rediscovered Mendel's work and put it together with Darwin's ideas. This was a huge moment. It led to what we call the modern synthesis of evolution. It married genetics with natural selection. Now we had a clearer picture, random changes or mutations happen in genes. Some of these changes are helpful, some are harmful, some do nothing. Natural selection then acts on the individuals carrying these genes, favoring the helpful ones. Over vast stretches of time, this process builds new species. It was a powerful framework, and it's still the bedrock of our understanding. But that was just the beginning. The modern synthesis gave us the theory. The last few decades, and especially the last 10 or 20 years, have given us incredible tools to see it happening, to trace it, to dig into the details in ways Darwin or Mendel couldn't even dream of. One of the biggest game changers has been genomics. This is the study of DNA. For a long time, figuring out the sequence of DNA and then the specific order of its chemical letters was incredibly hard and expensive. Now, it's getting faster and cheaper all the time. What does sequencing DNA tell us? It tells us the blueprint of life. Every living thing has DNA or RNA in some viruses. By comparing the DNA of different species, we can see how closely related they are. It's like looking at family trees, but on a grand scale. We share a lot of our DNA with chimpanzees, for instance, which makes sense because we share a relatively recent common ancestor. We share less with the banana, but we still share some basic genes because all life shares a common, very ancient ancestor. This genetic evidence is incredibly powerful. It confirms what we saw in the fossil record and what Darwin guessed. It gives us a way to measure relatedness with amazing precision. Genomics has done more than just confirm relationship. It lets us trace human migration patterns out of Africa. It shows us where different human populations split off. It helps us understand diseases by looking at our own genetic variations. And for evolution, it allows us to see the genetic changes that might have led to big evolutionary innovations. We can look at the genes that control development, for example, and see how small changes in those genes might have led to big changes in body plans. And then there's the fossil record. People often think of it as just a collection of old bones. But every new fossil find is like finding a missing page in a very old book. For a long time, critics of evolution would point to missing links, gaps in the fossil record. While perfect, unbroken sequences are rare, we've found so many transitional forms now that the missing link argument feels very outdated. We have fossils that show the transition from fish to land animals, from dinosaurs to birds, from land mammals back to whales, and crucially, from ape-like ancestors to humans. The discoveries in human evolution alone have been astounding. We have a rich fossil record of hominins our direct ancestors and close relatives stretching back millions of years in Africa. Each new skull, each new jawbone, each new set of footprints tells us more about how we came to walk upright, how our brains grew, how we developed tools. We're still finding new species of ancient humans and new information about their lives all the time. These aren't just isolated finds, they build a consistent picture. Beyond fossils and DNA, we have other tools. One cool area is called developmental biology, or evo-devo. It looks at how a single fertilized egg develops into a complex organism. What scientists found is truly amazing. The same genes, or very similar ones, control fundamental body plans in vastly different animals. For example, genes that tell a fly where to put its head and tail are similar to genes that do the same job in a human. This means evolution often doesn't invent entirely new things from scratch. It often reuses old genetic toolkits in new ways. A small tweak in a regulatory gene, a gene that switches other genes on or off RAM, can have a huge effect on an organism's shape without needing to change every single gene. This explains how big changes can happen without needing endless tiny mutations. Another powerful tool is the molecular clock. If we know how quickly mutations generally accumulate in a piece of DNA, we can use that rate to estimate when two species last shared a common ancestor. It's like using a ticking clock inside our genes. This helps us put dates on evolutionary events that might not have a strong fossil record. It's not perfect, but it provides a powerful, independent way to cross-check what we see in fossils. For example, it tells us that our split from chimpanzees happened around 6 to 8 million years ago, a figure largely consistent with the fossil evidence. And then there's gene editing technology like CRISPR. While it's primarily used in medicine, it's also a powerful research tool. We can use it to turn genes on or off, to change them, and then see what happens. This lets us essentially whirlwind or fast-forward evolutionary changes in the lab to understand the function of specific genes and how they might have contributed to new traits. It helps us understand the mechanisms of evolution in a way that was impossible before. We can test hypotheses about what a particular genetic change might have done in the past. So when people say we're on the verge, they have a lot of good reasons. We have mountains of data from DNA sequencing. We have a richer fossil record than ever before. We understand the developmental processes that shape bodies. We have sophisticated computational models that can simulate evolution. We have the ability to manipulate genes. All these different lines of evidence, genetics, paleontology, developmental biology, ecology, all point in the same direction. They tell a consistent, cohesive story. It's like having a puzzle with millions of pieces, and suddenly, we have really good pictures on many of those pieces, and we can start to see big sections of the puzzle come together. The overall picture is clear, and the details are filling in at an astonishing rate. But here's the honest part. Are we on the verge of solving our entire origin story? Maybe not the entire story, at least not in a way that means we'll have every single question answered. There are still huge mysteries. One of the biggest, and one I mentioned earlier, is abiogenesis. How did life start from non-life? Evolution explains how life changes once it exists, but it doesn't explain that first spark. We've made progress in understanding the conditions on early Earth. We know about things like RNA being able to store genetic information and act as an enzyme, suggesting an RNA world before DNA took over. We've found amino acids and other building blocks of life in meteorites. We can create some of these building blocks in lab simulations of early Earth. But getting from simple organic molecules to a self-replicating, evolving system, a true living cell, is still a massive leap. It's a hugely active area of research, but we are definitely not on the verge of having a definitive step-by-step account of how life began. That feels more like a frontier we've just started to explore. Then there's consciousness. This is a big one. How did a collection of cells in a brain give rise to subjective experience, to feeling, to awareness, to I? We know that brains evolved. We can trace the growth of complexity in nervous systems. We can see how different parts of the brain are involved in different functions. But the leap from physical processes to the feeling of being alive, of experiencing the world, that's often called the hard problem of consciousness. It's not clear if science, as we currently understand it, can ever fully explain it. Evolution gave us the physical machinery, but the nature of consciousness itself remains deeply mysterious. There are also big evolutionary transitions that we still don't fully understand. How did multicellularity arise, for instance? How did single-celled organisms decide to stick together and become complex, many-celled creatures? We have some good ideas, but the exact sequence of events, the specific genetic changes, are still being worked out. The evolution of complex organs, like the eye, used to be a point of contention. Critics said, how could something so complex evolve step by step? But we now know that eyes evolved many times independently, and we can see clear intermediate steps in living animals today, from simple light-sensing spots to complex camera-like eyes. Still, the specific detailed path for every complex organ is a massive amount of detail to uncover. And what about the role of chance versus determinism in evolution? If we could rewind the tape of life, as the famous biologist Stephen Jay Gould put it, and play it again, would the outcome be the same? Would intelligent life evolve again? Would humans exist? Or are we just a lucky accident, the result of a particular chain of events that could have gone in a million different directions? We know that random events, like meteor strikes or massive volcanic eruptions, have profoundly shaped the course of evolution by causing mass extinctions. But how much of what we see is truly random, and how much is inevitable given the rules of physics and chemistry? That's a philosophical and scientific debate that we're far from settling. Another area that's getting a lot of attention is epigenetics. This is about changes in gene expression that don't involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence. Think of it like turning a light switch on or off rather than changing the wiring. These epigenetic marks can sometimes be passed down to offspring, meaning environmental influences can have effects that stretch across generations without altering the genes themselves. How big a role does epigenetics play in long-term evolution? We're still figuring that out. It adds another layer of complexity to how traits are inherited and how organisms adapt. And honestly, we've only really scratched the surface of life on Earth. Most of life is microbial. Most microbes have never been cultured in a lab. We call this microbial dark matter. We know they exist from their DNA and environmental samples, but we don't know much about what they do or how they fit into the grand evolutionary tapestry. Understanding this hidden majority of life is a huge ongoing project. Imagine trying to understand the history of life when you only know about a tiny fraction of the players. So, what does it mean to solve our origin story? Does it mean having every single detail, every mutation, every environmental pressure for every single species from the beginning of life until now? If that's the bar, then no, we'll probably never solve it completely. The past is vast. The data is immense, and some things might simply be unknowable due to the passage of time. Fossils are rare. DNA degrades. But maybe solving it means something else. Maybe it means having such a robust, detailed, and coherent narrative that we understand the major transitions, the key mechanisms, the broad outlines, and many of the finer details. Maybe it means we have a story that is so well supported by multiple independent lines of evidence that it becomes undeniable, even if a few chapters are still a bit hazy. And in that sense, we are very, very close. The story of evolution, from simple cells to complex organisms, to us, is already incredibly well understood. It's supported by overwhelming evidence. We understand the basic rules, we see the patterns. And with every new discovery in genetics, in paleontology, in developmental biology, in bioinformatics, the story gets richer, more detailed, and even more beautiful. And it's not like solving a simple math problem that has one single answer. It's more like understanding a vast, intricate, epic poem. We might not know every word of every line, but we grasp the plot, the characters, the themes, and we're continually refining our understanding of the language. We are building an incredibly detailed family tree of all life on Earth. We are filling in the branches, the twigs, and even the leaves at an astounding pace. So, are we on the verge? Yes and no. We are on the verge of an incredibly detailed, comprehensive understanding of the evolutionary journey that led to us. The broad strokes are clear, and the fine brushwork is happening rapidly, but the very first origin of life itself, and the deepest mysteries like consciousness, still feel like distant peaks we are just beginning to trek towards. It's a humbling and awe-inspiring journey, and it's far from over. Our origin story isn't a fixed book that will one day be finished. It's a living narrative, constantly being updated and expanded by new discoveries. And that's actually pretty exciting. We are, in a way, writing the story as we go, using the evidence the universe has left for us.